My A levels were in economics, history and government and politics. I got to 21 and thought, do I want to continue in education or do I want to go into the world of work? And stumbled across the food manufacturing sector. Did a 18-month graduate scheme with a company called Northern Foods, and there was a job at McVitie's, and I applied for it and got it, and have been at McVitie's for 21 years. I think it's okay to fail. Things don't always go the way you plan. The big piece of advice I would give everybody and give my own team now is that you have to have a work-life balance and you have to be able to disconnect. So I think the emphasis has changed.
Hi everyone, it's Carl Veltman here and welcome to our first episode of Season 2 of the Expert Lounge. Each of the experts we interview for this podcast is spending time with us to reflect on their career and share the lessons they've learned along the way. Our guests are here to share with you how they got to where they are today, including their amazing successes, the unfortunate setbacks and the things that they've learned along the way. So whether you're reaching the end of your studies and looking for your first job, or perhaps you're ambitious and looking to advance your career, our guests will share their stories with you to help you make that next move. Our podcasts are themed around the key sectors that we're passionate about supporting here at Calderdale College, from engineering and advanced manufacturing to the creative industries. So, to kick off our second podcast series, today's guest joins us from the manufacturing world, specifically working in food manufacturing at a household brand we all know and love. A man with decades of experience who is the driving force behind one of Calderdale's most renowned manufacturing sites. I'm delighted to welcome Richard Armstrong, the site manager of McVitie's. Hi Richard.
Hello, good morning.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you, yeah.
Well, brilliant to welcome you here into the Expert Lounge, and
Thank
I'm
you.
really looking forward to finding out a bit more about you.
Yeah.
So, site manager for McVitie's.
Site compliance manager.
Site compliance manager.
So I sort of had a dotted line into the overall site manager and a direct reporting line into a centralised function. My expertise or my areas of responsibility are food safety and quality, as well as intermittently engagement, environment, health and safety as well.
Okay, so quite a big remit.
Yeah, quite a wide ranging remit.
And you know, I don't think there's anyone sort of listening or watching this podcast that won't have heard of the name McVitie's.
No.
So, you know, that's to work for such a well-known, a renowned, historic manufacturing company like McVitie's. How did you end up there? Can you talk us through that career journey from education to your current role?
Yeah, sure. So,
sorry, Richard, I am while you're.
No, please. I mean,
I'm not about product placement, but it seems
why not?
It would be amiss of me not to eat.
Thank you very much. So I grew up in this is the time when I eat and try and talk at the same time, isn't it? I grew up in Northumberland, so about 120 miles away. And Northumberland's a little bit different education setup to Calderdale. It's first, middle, and high. So when it came to A levels, my A levels were in economics, history and government and politics, and I did AS levels in maths and general studies.
That sounds quite heavy going, Richard.
Yeah, but you can just talk your way around rather than having to learn maths. So, and then that led to me reading politics at university, which was the University of Sheffield, and principally kind of political history. So a much stronger element of the history side rather than the nuts and bolts of politics. And then I got to 21 and thought, do I want to continue in education or do I want to go into the world of work? And took the decision that I wanted to go into the world of work, and stumbled across the food manufacturing sector, and did a 18-month graduate scheme with a company called Northern Foods, which is a food manufacturing group and has a group of different brands, essentially. It doesn't actually exist anymore. The brands included Fox's, for example, but the sites I worked at were Park Cakes, which was Bolton and Oldham, which made cakes as you'd expect, pies and tarts and things like that. And I was made redundant in 2003 or at the back end of 2002, and took the decision that much of what they did was retailer own label. So Asda or Tesco's or Sainsbury's or Waitrose or M&S, give them the product and they make it for them. And I took the decision that actually I wanted to go into a company which were branded. So McVitie's or Kellogg's or Nestle, that type of company. And there was a job at McVitie's, and I applied for it and got it, and I've been at McVitie's for 21 years.
Wow.
So McVitie's at the time was owned by United Biscuits, and was then taken over by the Ulka family, who were a Turkish family, and became part of Pladis. And Pladis also encompassed brands such as Godiva, Jacobs, Cars, and over in Turkey, the Ulka name as well.
Okay. That's really interesting, because I think a lot of consumers that know the brand won't necessarily, have an appreciation for the fact that it sits within a bigger corporation.
It's a huge global company, and I mean it presents opportunities. It also presents red tape and frustrations, because you are trying to standardise across a number of continents, not just countries, and it's very difficult sometimes to standardise between, say, ourselves and Manchester, let alone ourselves and Nigeria, or ourselves and Turkey, or ourselves in Northern Europe or America. But it also presents great opportunities because you can share best practice. Yeah. And actually what it also does is it allows you to cross-pollinate in terms of experience. I had the opportunity in 2018 to go over to America for a year. To work across the 2 US sites, which were based upstate in New York and in Pennsylvania. So again, those opportunities are there, if you want them. I had a friend that went to run the factory in Romania at the same sort of time. So like I say, it from a personal development point of view, it gives you the opportunity to broaden your own experience, really, because it's living in a different country with different cultures and different pressure points and things like that. But from a company point of view, you can share best practice.
I think what's really interesting about that is, I think historically people went to work for a firm, stayed there most of their life, perhaps got a nice watch on retirement. But actually, people are much more likely to move jobs and job roles now.
Yeah.
But you've been within the same business for 21 years. Yeah. It's interesting to hear you talk about the growth and development opportunities that you've had, because that's clearly kept you engaged and wanting to stay there.
Very much so. So I started out as a team coordinator. We then restructured, and I became a team manager, which had more autonomy and more responsibilities. And that was all in manufacturing. So that was for about 9 years. And then I took the decision that I wanted to change, and decided to apply for the QA manager, so the quality assurance manager. Was fortunate enough on the second time of applying to get it. Which again, when you talk about setbacks and how do you bounce back and things like that, I wasn't successful the first time around, but I was the second time I applied, which was a year later, and moved into that role. And eventually that role expanded in its scope, and I became a member of the leadership team for the site. So there has been that opportunity for growth and development, and I think sometimes, and I know we'll come on to what influences your choices, from a work point of view, from a career point of view. But I took the decision of in terms of the balance, in terms of work-life balance, that traveling 3 nights a week in a hotel wasn't probably something I wanted to do after experiencing it for 9 months when I came back from the States. But I've had the opportunity to grow my own role almost, because from a site point of view, something that we needed to do was to have a bigger influence in the community and bigger presence in the community. And again, I'm sure we'll go on to that, but that gave me the opportunity, as somebody who'd lived here for 2 decades, as a sort of adopted Halifaxian, to be able to influence that agenda and shape that agenda, which is again a huge challenge, because it's something that probably we haven't done enough of in the past sort of 20 years. So again, you can often make those opportunities for yourself, as well as when the opportunities arise, take them.
So, I mean, we've had a little nibble on a Jaffa.
We have.
you must have open access to as many biscuits as you want working at McVitie's. But other than the biscuits, and we'll come on to whether that's a Jaffa cake's a cake or a biscuit in a moment. But other than the sweet treats, what is it about working in the food industry that excites you the most?
Well, I think always people are going to need to eat. So in terms of an industry, I mean, when I think back to when my father was probably my age, and I was young, I grew up in the Northeast. So when you think about in the 1980s, and probably slightly before I was born, what were the big industries in the Northeast? Well, it was things like mining, it was steelworks, and at the time in the 70s and 80s, you would have thought that those industries would have been around forever. Mm-hmm. And they're not there anymore, and so for the way that the economy changes, and we're a multinational, globalized world, it's very difficult to predict what's going to be relevant in the future and how the economy will change. We're always going to need food, and a lot of the time, some of the products we'll eat will be shorter on shelf life, so actually needs to be made in the UK. And again, the way that the food industry has had to change with social expectations, in terms of the desire for healthier alternatives, for the desire to try and bring our biscuits and cakes down to 100 calories or less for a portion size and things like that, then we've really got to be at that cutting edge. And again, it's very interesting. What you also get is a huge cross-section of society working in it, and there's a massive range of people and jobs that you can go into. I mean, I think 6 million people work in the food and grocery sector in the UK, which I think outside of those people employed by the government, it's probably the biggest sector in the UK. Yeah. So it's a massive, massive industry when you talk about from farm to fork.
I think what I get from that is you've got a real passion for your role and for the company that you're working for, and that kind of drives you moving forward in your career. I'm just interested, actually, when you were talking about, you talked about how society and expectation, whether it's sort of calories in biscuits, changes. I was having a look at the history of McVitie's, and I was fascinated to see that in 1945, sort of end of the war, there was a real focus back on the core brand, and the company went from manufacturing 370 different biscuit varieties down to 10.
Right.
And I thought, wow, I mean that's a significant sort of narrowing of the production line, isn't it? But I guess society was changing, the world was evolving, and so the business had to respond.
And I'm pretty sure that I'm right that digestive biscuits originally were something, as the name suggests, that was supposed to aid the digestive system. A little bit like Lucozade, for example, was originally a sort of a drink that your doctor would give you if you weren't feeling very well, and they obviously rebranded themselves incredibly cleverly to become a kind of a sport energy drink. And similarly, digestives, I'm pretty sure when their original carnation were there to aid the digestive system rather than being a kind of an everyday treat.
I mean, I don't know whether this makes me old, but I remember when I was ill as a child, my mum would bring in a glass bottle of Lucozade. And you'd have little sort of small amounts to sip on during the day.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if my mum did, but yes, definitely.
It was medicinal back in the day, before athletes were sort of using it to fuel their performance. So, I mean, I'm talking about me as a child. What about you? So you sort of as a teenage Richard. Did you think you'd have a career in the food manufacturing industry?
Absolutely not. No.
Let's imagine you're 14, 15. What was your ambition at that point?
Probably like every 13 or 14-year-old lad, I wanted to play professional football. I would have given anything to play for Manchester United. But and I think I didn't have any kind of preconceived idea of going into the food industry. I wanted to be a journalist, or I wanted to work in sport. my work experience was with the Newcastle Evening Chronicle, both in terms of the news desk, but also the finance department, and also a week on the sports department as well. So my initial thoughts were it was probably going to be journalism or education, or so I didn't, like I say, have any preconceived notion of I want to go into the food industry. But in a similar way, you know, when I entered the food industry and I chose manufacturing, that was because it, to me, presented a varied day-to-day life. It was working with people. Mm-hmm. It was producing something physically tangible at the end of the day. You know, you can look and say, I've made, you know, that amount of product today. And didn't really initially think that QA would necessarily be the route that I would eventually go into. Mm. And again, it's sometimes you're by luck of fortune. Yeah. And by luck of circumstance as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think sometimes, you know, you talked about going for a role and not getting it. Mm. I mean, you know, the impact of that could have gone either way, couldn't it? It could have changed your direction. As it stands, it reinforced your passion to get that role, and then you went for it and you got it. I mean, so there's that sort of organic process. Yeah. You know, the way a career can organically evolve in front of you.
And I've had friends who have said, you know, right from their 14, 15, I want to be a nurse, I want to be a doctor, or I want to work in that industry, or want to be a teacher, really early on, and full credit to them because they've taken that journey, they've pursued a vocational qualification, they've pursued vocational work experience, and now they're working in that industry. And that's absolutely wonderful. I've got a lot of friends as well who that wasn't a route that they've taken. You know, I've got a friend now that's a pilot. He had no idea he was going to be a pilot 20 years ago. He wanted to work in theatre. So, and similarly with many other people who have gone in different directions. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer when it comes to having a career plan, because I think, you know, it's horses for courses sometimes.
Yeah. I guess, you know, people will have different routes to their career, but I think we all take sort of influences and inspiration from the people around us. Who are the key people that have inspired you along your journey?
I think it's been the people who have taken a risk with me, I think. I didn't come into a QA role through a technical background, which at the time, which was 2012, when I looked at my peer set across the UK and Ireland, across the 7 or 8 sites, I stood out like a sore thumb. You know, I came from a manufacturing background, and not that I'd gone to university and studied nutrition and things like that. And I was recruited on behaviours rather than acquired skills. I mean, clearly I had the competency and the aptitude to be able to succeed. But I think that fundamentally changed my outlook on recruitment and development in particular, because I think it's very easy to want to employ someone with so much experience. Actually, how do you know that experience has been good experience? And if you've got the intelligence and the competency, you can learn how to do a HACCP study. You can learn the fundamentals of food safety. But what I can't teach someone is to have the passion, the drive, the behaviours, the empathy, the dogmaticness to keep on going. They're behaviours that you either have or you don't have. And it's much easier, like I say, to teach someone the fundamentals of food safety and not teach them how to be passionate and dedicated and loyal and honest and empathetic.
Yeah, okay, so those core values, and actually, you know, when you're talking about what makes someone employable, it's often their values and those softer skills than the actual sort of technical skills, which can be trained, can be taught.
Very much so.
I'm interested because you talked about standing out like a sore thumb amongst your sort of peers within the business.
Yeah.
In your role, have there been times where you've had imposter syndrome? And if there have been, how have you dealt with that?
Constantly, I think. Yeah, constantly. Because I always think that there's somebody with more knowledge than me, and there always is. But I think it's knowing where to be signposted to be able to get the right answer, having the confidence to say I don't know, but also having the confidence to understand that you're there for a reason, that I do have 12 years worth of experience in this role and 20 years plus within the food sector. So I have a lot of lived experiences as well. But I think being brave enough to say, I don't know, but I'll find out, is really critical, because then people will come back to you and ask you. And yeah, next time you might have the answer. But people will come to you because they feel that the response they will get will be honest and not somebody that's essentially trying to blag their way through. And particularly when you're trying to talk about reasonably important decisions that you have to make, or to get information in order to aid the decision making that are important. When we're talking about microbiology, when you're talking about the growth of organisms and pathogens in food, you have to get those decisions right. And so, like I say, having the confidence to know when to say, I can't give you an answer now, I'm going to go and find out about it. And I think the difference I found in the early days was, generally speaking, when you look at people's preferences, you're either on the side of task or people. And don't get me wrong, it's never completely binary, but you influence one way or the other. And for me, it's very much on the people element. And then you've got another wheel that says introvert or extrovert, and I'm always leaning towards extrovert, which at the time when I first came in, not just in terms of the leadership team at Halifax, but within my own function, I was kind of the outlier. And now that's not the case anymore, and it's far better balanced. And I think what we've found, particularly in my own function in quality food safety, is that more and more we're looking at behaviours, and more we're looking at making sure that teams are balanced in a variety of different issues, but factors rather, but certainly that as well.
Okay, so I think the message there is it's okay to have imposter syndrome, but have the confidence and self-belief to go with your conviction, but also have the humility to say, actually, I don't know that.
Absolutely, because we can't be subject matter experts in everything.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is building those relationships with those subject matter experts, particularly people whose interests and behaviours and experiences differ from your own, because actually probably the most productive relationships I've had with people are people who are my polar opposite.
Yeah.
And because you complement each other.
It's an interesting point, actually, because one of the skills I think of leadership is about building the team, around you.
Yeah.
The diversity of that team.
Yeah.
And sort of with all the skill sets.
Yeah.
And attributes that you need to ensure that the organisation is a success.
Yeah.
So, with all that in mind, I'm thinking about Richard on his first day at McVitie's.
Yeah.
Did you have a biscuit that day?
I'm pretty sure I had a cake.
Cake.
And more than one. I think I had a Jamaica ginger cake, I imagine.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't got any of that.
No.
I could offer you a...
My personal favourite of all the biscuits we make, actually, the milk chocolate digestives. I still think...
No, I'm happy to crack another packet open, Richard. So...
I mean, when you talk about what makes you proud at work, I mean, the brands that you've got on the table here, thank you very much, which are milk chocolate digestives, Jaffa cakes, we make Jamaica ginger at Halifax, Hobnobs. There are heritage brands which, as a company, from a McVitie's point of view, we've been making for generations. And actually, yes, of course, I'm biased, but these heritage brands, for me, are there's nothing better comparing in the market. What makes you proud is the fact that I'm a custodian for those brands. It isn't my role, because in a number of years' time, I'm sure I'll move on or I'll retire and someone will take that on. And really what I want is to make sure that these products are just as good now as they were when I first came into McVitie's 21 years ago.
I think, I can connect with some of what you said there, because certainly we look at the college in the same respect.
Yeah.
The college has been here 130 years. We are merely the custodians of it, and we hope to sort of steer it through,
Yeah.
and pass it on to the next people that will continue to develop it.
It's the same with the community as well, isn't it? Because I mean, yes, you've got responsibility for the four walls and for the building and for the premises and for your perimeter, as we do, but actually, you want to leave this facility in a better place than you found it. But actually, in order for that to happen, we also need to make sure our community and our immediate vicinity in terms of Calderdale, in terms of Halifax, is as strong as it was 21 years ago. And that means, reaching out to other businesses and partners and developing the next generation, but also developing the community as well. I mean, one of the things that I was really, passionate about was we needed to expand our mental health first aiders on site. And again, mental health is probably something that wasn't talked about 20 years ago. And has probably only really been seriously talked about, for 5, 10 maximum. And we had, we decided we'd bring a company in and we'd do proper mental health first aid training. Probably in years gone by with training courses, we said as a company, well, if we can't fill all the places at Halifax, we'll talk to Manchester, or we'll talk to Aintree, or we'll talk to Harlesden, talk to other companies within our group. But this time we made the conscious decision to have only so many for Halifax and to offer 5 places to some of our community partners. So Focus for Hope, Halifax Amateur Operatic Society, Halifax Ladies Rugby. And we reached out to them and said, well, do you want to come on this course completely for free? Because not only will that help you in your role within your voluntary organisation, most of which were charities, but actually your full-time employer will also get the benefit because they've got a trained mental health first aider. Yeah. So we made that very, very conscious decision. So not only are we developing the capability of people on our site to have those really important discussions and signpost people when they need to be signposted, but we're also trying to help the wider community as well.
Yeah, and I think, again, we can connect to that here at the college, partnerships and the work that we do with other organisations, but, for and with the community are incredibly important. And I think you're right. Part of our role here as custodians is to continue that relationship and support for the people and the place. I think we might have touched on this, but just looking back, is there any piece of advice that you wish you'd received early in your career or earlier in your career?
I think wish I'd received or wish I'd listened to are probably two very different things. So I think it's okay to fail. It's okay to not always, things don't always go the way you planned. And it's very difficult. I certainly found it very difficult not to take them very personally to begin with. And as much as I can think, I wish I hadn't, it's very difficult not to, because, when you care and when you're passionate about something. But I think the ability to try and maintain a level of detachment, I think actually improves you in the long term. I feel that I've become a better in my own role since I moved into a hobby outside of work that I could be equally as, passionate about, which is acting and musical theatre. But I think because I've got that additional distraction or additional passion, it allows me to switch off. And I think the big piece of advice I would give everybody and give my own team now is that you have to have a work-life balance and you have to be able to disconnect. Because if you can't, there's only one way you're going, and that's you're going to drive yourself down into becoming burnt out.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece of advice. Can you build? I mean,
yes,
you've
absolutely.
You've talked about taking things personally. I think there's a lot of us that do that when something doesn't quite get to where we want it to be, or. But is that fixed? Can we build that resilience?
I think it's fixed when you've got other things to concentrate on, other things to discuss, and when you've got the ability to be able to switch off. I think if you can't switch off and you can't detach yourself, then I think you take that problem home and that continues to live at the back of your unconscious brain, really. So I think that's really important. I think I think that separation between work and once you've left, you need to be able to concentrate on something else. I think in terms of work-life balance, I think certainly the food industry, but I think probably work in general has moved on significantly since COVID. And I think probably 10 years ago, yes, people looked at who was the last person to leave the office. They did. Now that's not the case. Now people will be challenged if they're seen as constantly working late or coming in early, because you then go, well, is there something there that we need to support with? Is it workload? How do we support that? So I think the emphasis has changed. Another really good example actually is we have auditors. And we have had auditors in the past who have thought, well, I can avoid an extra day's travel. I'm staying in a hotel. Can we just start early and finish late? Now, probably previously, we would bow down to that and say, absolutely. Now it's a hard no. And actually, what was really interesting was that we are audited by BRC, British Retail Consortium, which is essentially our license to operate and make sure that we're producing food in a safe and hygienic manner, and that we're doing what we say we're doing. And the lady came, a really nice auditor came, and she said, do you mind if we have a bit of a later finish? And I said, well, yeah, I don't mind starting at 8:30 and we can go on till 5:30, but not before or after, because my people will come in a little bit earlier, or my team, including myself, will be in earlier and to prepare and be staying on later. And obviously it's a stressful situation being audited, as you guys will find out, with Ofsted and things like that. It's our equivalent of Ofsted. And then they've got to drive home. And I feel like I've got a duty of care from the minute they set off in the morning to the minute they get home. So no, I want to finish at, I want to finish at 5 to make sure out of the door for 5:30, because actually these people's welfare is really important. And people's initial reaction will be, well, that person must go, what do you mean you're saying no? And the auditor went, it's a really good point, actually. No, I completely agree with that. Great idea. Yeah. I've not heard that before, but I like that answer. So yes, that's fine. Good. And actually, when you put it like that, I think more people are reasonable than not.
I think what I'd like to say, quite a brave thing to do when you're in that.
Brave setting. Or stupid, it turned out to be brave. Thank you.
So, thinking about your leadership style then, because you've obviously had to adapt your approach when you're dealing with different teams or different people, different challenges. So, how would you describe your leadership style?
I think I'm reasonably informal. But also I'm not a micromanager. That's not in my nature. So for me, it's about developing people and giving them the skills and also the autonomy to be able to make decisions for themselves. There's such a wide-ranging amount of activities and things that need to be done and covered off that one person can't be expected to do that. And I think making sure that your team are equipped. Yes, they have to have some clear direction, but allowing them also to find their own way through problems. So it's very much managing through people. I think you do have to adapt, because I think it's Machiavelli, isn't it? There are times where you're in crisis, and actually, as a leader, you do have to step forward and you do have to be driving those decisions. But there are other times where actually, no, you don't. You can actually take a sit back. You can be able to observe how your team are, because, ultimately I've got people in my team who, if they're still here in 2 years' time, I'd be disappointed, because what I want to see that is for them to grow and grow, and then for their careers to progress. And if you're constantly clipping people's wings, that isn't going to happen. Yeah.
So when you're talking about you've talked about tasks and people, and you said that you're much more aligned to people.
Yeah.
When things go wrong, when there are challenges, how do you go about diagnosing the root cause? That can be really difficult sometimes when you're managing large teams, complex teams.
Yeah.
Things aren't quite going right. How do you put a finger on it? How do you diagnose the problem?
I think by not jumping in and trying to treat the symptom and trying to solve it before you understand the problem. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a variety of different root cause analysis techniques, and it's not rocket science techniques. It's things like fishbone, it's things like speedy Kaizen and 5 whys. And so I think it's engaging initially, having the right people in the room. If we've got a problem on a manufacturing line, having a root cause session purely filled by managers who work in the office, you're probably not going to get to the root cause. Actually, what you need is the people who are there every single day who can tell you something's changed. So making sure that you remove any level of hierarchy and you remove any level of seniority in terms of position, and you make sure that the people that are in there are the right people based on their knowledge. And again, it's going through that in a methodical manner. And of course, there's training. There's training in lean manufacturing techniques, and there's training in problem solving. And the more that you do that, the better equipped you are. I mean, I started doing it when I was a manufacturing team manager, because I used to watch House MD on ITV or whichever channel it was on with which was Gregory House on Hugh Laurie. And what he would ever do with all these problems was he'd have a massive whiteboard, and he'd say, tell me anything and everything that could go wrong, and wrote down everything. Is it that? No. Why isn't it that? And then, it was basically a root cause analysis session, but on television, if as an entertainment. And yeah, it's a similar sort of technique, really.
Okay. I mean, it sounds to me, you've clearly got a huge amount of experience. You've clearly had a lot of training and support, but you've also developed and grown in that role while you've been there.
There's a massive distinction between training and learning as well, and I think that's really important for people to distinguish. That just because I send you on a HACCP course or a fundamentals of food safety, and you receive that training, that doesn't mean to say that you've learned it. It means to say that you've gone through the material, you can retain the material to a certain extent, and you can understand what's being explained to you. Actually, the step after training is putting that into practice, and that's where you engage with the learning. And if you don't use that training, you're going to lose it, because other things come along, you're not going to retain that knowledge. So I think it's really important to get that distinction, so that learning and development is seen as learning and development, not training and development, because actually training starts and it moves into learning to cement that knowledge.
It's a really good point. And I think what I'm perhaps interested in, following on from the conversation about your leadership style and how you deal with teams, you talked about, sort of coaching and mentoring staff who you want to see develop and progress in their careers. But there'll be times where, you've had to deal with other challenging circumstances. Do you have to adapt your approach and your leadership style sometimes? Do you find that easy?
I think that adapting my leadership style or adapting the way I communicate, by and large, no. And that's come from experience. It also comes from being a natural extrovert. In terms of having challenging conversations, it's a skill and it's tough, and it's not something that naturally sits within my natural skill set, and I'm absolutely honest about that. It doesn't mean to say that I duck those questions, and it doesn't mean to say that I duck those conversations, because, I would be, not doing my role as a manager to do that. But I think it's making sure that I plan the conversation, that I don't do it on impulse, but also that the feedback I'm giving and the conversations that I'm giving are about what I have seen, what I feel, rather than second-hand and third information. And the more structured it is, and the more fact-based it is and more evidence-based, the easier it is to have those discussions. But, I've found in 20 years, and still find, that the most stressful occasions often aren't when a project hasn't gone well. It's when someone's upset, or there's a conflict or there's a conflict that you've had to resolve, or there's a conflict that you've been part of. That's far more, that sticks in your brain a lot more than a machine hasn't ran well for 12 hours.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree. And I think absolutely endorse everything you said there about, having difficult conversations. I think, there are ways to facilitate those conversations, so that it doesn't become you delivering a list of issues or problems. But if you can engage in discussion where you explore the issues.
Yeah.
Quite often people will identify where there's problems, underperformance, and acknowledge it, and often will be grateful for having had the opportunity to get that out in the open.
And again, it goes back to if there's a more sort of mechanical problem, or there's, you don't want to treat the symptom, you want to understand the root cause. It's the same with people, because, ultimately it's very easy to jump to assumptions. That person's lazy, or that person doesn't have the competency to do that, or that person's just not interested in it, or, and actually there's a lot more to it than that. There's that really famous diagram of a man with a rock on his back trying to hold a woman who's falling off a cliff, and in the middle of the cliff is a snake. Yeah. She can't see the rock and he can't see the snake, and she's thinking, why can't he pull harder? Not realizing there's a massive rock on his back, and he's thinking, well, why can't she? Why is she losing her grip, and why can't she make more of an effort? Not realizing there's a snake that could bite her if she does. And until you actually have those conversations and interrogate and actually understand the root of the issue, you don't know what else is going on.
Mm-hmm. And it's that ability to be able to see something from another perspective, isn't it?
And if people coming up with their own solutions is far better than you offering that solution. And I think that's really important from a feedback point of view, which is, again, it's very tempting to say, this is how you need to do it. Actually, what's far more effective is allowing that person to come up with the solution themselves. Yeah. And I've done that, in not just in my own role, but I've directed musicals, directed a musical at Victoria Theatre in Halifax, and you do that similarly with the cast as well. There are times you go, yes, you absolutely need to do that, but there's also things that happen where you have to have the confidence to allow people to sometimes work the problem out themselves.
Yeah, agreed. We've got so many biscuits
and we have
here. I think I'm just going to put those down for a second. I'd like you to choose our third delicacy of the day.
It has to be chocolate hobnob, doesn't it?
I think it does.
Do
Interestingly, Richard, I didn't realise it's quite late. The hobnob didn't come along until 1985.
I know. It's very surprising, isn't it? I very much found that out, yeah. And I believe it was an employee suggestion as well.
Well, it makes sense, because I remember it must have been when they'd just been launched, eating these sort of day in, day out as a child. I think originally they weren't chocolate coated.
Correct, yeah.
But, beautiful.
They're great, aren't they?
Yeah. Really are.
Yeah.
I think you do, with a hobnob, you do need a drink. Because there is... it can be challenging to sort of get it down and swallow it.
Caffeine is definitely, and coffee is definitely your friend.
Absolutely. Try a bit of that coffee with that chocolate hobnob.
We're dunking, are we?
Well, actually, we could do that. Have you seen the Peter Kay sketch where he talks about, it's part of his stand-up show, and he's talking about biscuits?
Oh, right, yeah.
And he takes on the personality of different biscuit types. And I'm sure it's the hobnob that he says is like the, warrior of...
Yeah.
Delicious. Right. Back to the interview.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to put pressure on you, Richard. With the next couple of questions, I'm going to ask you to give me sort of very short.
Okay.
So it's almost like a quickfire round, okay? Okay. Significant innovations or developments that you're particularly proud of at McVitie's?
I'm particularly proud of that we've actively gone out as a site, off our own back, and decided we want to develop our strategy with the community. We want to develop the next generation of people. We want structured support around charities that actually matter to our people.
Brilliant. So, thinking about career support advice, what advice would you give to someone who's just starting out in the food manufacturing sector?
do not think that there is a linear path to progression. Do not think that if you start on as an operator on a manufacturing line, that the only way you can go is through an advanced team member, a team manager, a manufacturing manager, that actually you can go sideways and upwards.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much.
And you're better at your job, actually, when you experience life in another function, just like life in a different part of the country, or another country. But you are a far better QA manager having had manufacturing experience. You're a far better HR manager if you've worked in manufacturing. You're a far better engineer if you've had some food safety quality experience. So actually, different experiences broadens your mind, and makes you much less silo when you're thinking.
Well, it's back to the rock and snake again, isn't it? It's about seeing things from another perspective, and then that enables you to empathise with people in other roles and with other challenges other than your own. So, touching on the idea of trying different roles, food manufacturing sector, quite a varied industry. Yeah. Just tell us about the range of career opportunities.
The best way of looking at it is when you pick up a box of biscuits or a cake on the supermarket shelf, ask yourself what jobs have gone on to enable you to pick up that and to purchase that. And that's people working in the supermarkets. That's people that are delivery drivers. That goes back to the people who manufacture the products, but also the farmers. But also, what goes on in that factory? There is an HR personnel body to make sure that the procedures are followed and that people are treated fairly. People are paid. Who pays them? It's wages. We have to make sure that what's on the back of our packet meets legal standards. We have a regulatory department. How do you know that this exists in the first place? Social media, marketing, sales, commercial. There are people that develop the next hobnob or the next Jaffa cake. So there's marketing. So there's a gigantic and vast and varied range of jobs that go into making a packet of biscuits. So don't just think it's the dark satanic mills and it's coming, matchstick men and matchstick cats and dogs. Don't think and don't have those preconceptions, because actually we have factories. They are not like that. But we also have head office and we have people that work from home. So there's such a variety of jobs that those 6 million people that work in the food and grocery sector fill.
And I think, we're often blind to that, aren't we? As consumers, we see the product on the shelf, we buy it, we consume it, and you've sort of talked there about a number of roles and jobs that I wouldn't have immediately connected.
Yeah. And actually, you can apply that to the the studies that people do at school as well, because actually, if you want to be an engineer, absolutely doing engineering helps. Nutrition, when you do health and nutrition, absolutely helps for a job in regulatory. It helps for a job in developing the product. English and maths are absolutely and utterly fundamental to everything you do, and it doesn't have to be our own industry. It can be any industry. Similarly, if you do history like myself, you look at the transferable skills in something like history or English language. Well, you're looking at gathering a load of information, making conclusions, making recommendations, meeting deadlines, presenting material in a concise and articulate way to frame your argument. That's exactly what you do in industry. And again, not just the food industry, but see, that's what we're talking about today. So, every subject that we've had a couple of sessions where we've gone out to schools, or I've gone out to educational institutions and said, people, the colleges and universities and schools, when they're not putting on these courses for fun, they're putting them on because they have meaning and they have a huge amount of transferable skills that when you go into the world of work, you're going to really be glad that you had the chance to develop and practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's a key aspect of education that we are, getting young people to understand how the learning that's taking place connects them to the next step in their journey. We've talked about soft skills, we've talked about values and how they support people through their career. Do you look for specific qualifications or skills when hiring different roles? I mean, you've talked about actually.
Yeah.
We've talked about values, but would you look for skill set or a particular set of quals?
Yes, no. I think ultimately having a basic command of maths and English is really, really important. But essentially, am I looking for qualifications? Qualifications like degrees and apprenticeships and things like that, they're great in that they give you a foot in the door and it opens up that opportunity. But they're only good if you've actually taken the learning from them. And, as my own career has shown, that, I've gone from doing history and politics into doing food safety and quality. There doesn't seem to be a very natural linear progression for that. But actually, when you consider all of the things that I needed to have and do to be successful in my educational life, they're very, very transferable. So I think it can be dependent upon the role. I mean, there are certain areas that, yes, having the qualification, bringing somebody in as an electrical engineer that's had absolutely no exposure to engineering is far more difficult than me bringing in a quality assurance technologist who hasn't necessarily been exposed to food safety and quality. But by and large, it's about experience, and it's about learning from those experiences. It's about the ability to be able to reflect on them, both the positive ones and the ones that perhaps aren't as positive, and using that lived experience to bring that to the table. So I think there's a danger that people get too hung up on qualifications. They're important, but actually experience is just as important. And it's not just about experience in the job you're doing. It's about, we've got people who have gone out and that will run local scout groups at a weekend. Well, if you think about the leadership qualities that it takes to run a scout group or to be the coach of a kids' football team, they're qualities that you can very easily bring to the world of work.
You touched briefly on apprenticeships.
Yeah.
What do you think of apprenticeships as a pathway into a career in the food manufacturing industry?
I think they're great.
Do you have apprentices at McVitie's, and how has that helped shape the business?
We have. What we were awakened to was the apprentice levy that the government introduced a few years ago now. And that probably acted as a burning platform for us as a business to bring in apprenticeships. Now, we took a step back and we looked at our workforce in the food industry, but also within the functions within that. And one function that stood out was engineering in particular, which was an ageing workforce. If we're being absolutely honest, engineering across the manufacturing sector across the UK and Ireland, not just Pladis, but in terms of everyone, is predominantly male-dominated, predominantly white, middle-aged, male-dominated. And we knew there was a burning platform, not just from an inclusion and a diversity point of view, but we were having employees who are getting older and we need to replace them. And there was an absence coming through of younger people interested in those sort of STEM jobs. So we were able to leverage that, use some of the apprentice levy, which for those people that don't know, any business or businesses have to pay in a certain amount of money to a centralised levy, which you can then apply for. So you can develop your own people, your own existing staff, or you can use it to take on an apprentice externally, both of which we've done. So where it's worked best is through our engineering and bringing people into that engineering function. And of course, it has two benefits. One, that education's paid for. So, I mean, today I appreciate that the tuition fees are significantly higher than when I was at university. I think I was the first cohort of people that had to pay tuition fees back in 1998, 99. But they're significantly higher. So you avoid some of that student debt. But there's also the practical element of, for those 2-3 years you're undertaking the apprenticeship, not only are you getting your education, but you're also getting valuable work experience. And also work experience amongst people who aren't your own age group, aren't necessarily from the same socio-economic background as you, aren't possibly from the same kind of religious background as you, people with very diverse experiences. So particularly younger people, you can soak that up like a sponge. And when you're coming out of your education, when you're coming out of that apprenticeship, there might be a job for you, fantastic. But you're in a far better position in the labour market to then be able to find something that's going to be really rewarding for you.
Sure. I think you mentioned there, an apprentice immersed in a very diverse environment and culture and set of people. Do you think that experienced staff within the business can learn something from new employees? And what benefits are there when you sort of foster innovation and creativity amongst new teams?
Absolutely, and I think the more varied and the more diverse your team and your business is, the better you're set up for long-term sustained growth and survival. If you've got if everyone looks like me and has come from the same background as me, has the same behaviours as me, has the same hobbies as me, interests as me, we're very myopic in terms of that group. Actually, the more variation you get better decisions, but it's more holistic discussions that you get. So 100%, one of the big challenges for food manufacturing, actually as a whole, is attracting young people to it. But they're vital fresh blood to be able to inject energy, enthusiasm, but also that different experiences. I've got a 19, 20-year-old girl that works for me, and some of the stuff she talks about on social media, I haven't got a clue what she's talking about. But actually, there's a great opportunity for us as a company to leverage that, to understand that actually that's the consumer of the future. It's also the employee of the future, if not now. So it's fresh ideas, it's fresh values. It's challenging the norm as well, because one of the things that certainly infuriates me, but I think one of the worst things you can ever hear in any role, in any industry, is, well, we've always done it like that. 300 years ago, we used to stone.
The phrase.
We used to stone people that we thought were witches. We don't do that anymore. Why don't we do that anymore? Because it's unbelievably daft. Yeah. And actually, it's the start of terminal decline. If you allow "we've always done it like that" to be a phrase that you use a lot in your business, because yes, you need experience, but you also need to embrace change.
You've talked about evolving as a business and as an employer. Just if you had to sum it up in sort of 3 statements, how does McVitie's support professional growth and development of your employees?
So we identify opportunities for secondment and development roles. And that's for our existing staff. We also open up for professional development in terms of there's education into a different role. So that's the first one. By creating these development roles, we give it all seconded roles. We're giving people the opportunity to live the role. But there's also development within the role, and appreciating that not everyone wants to be the next manager. What people want is a little bit more variety in the job, and actually are desperate to contribute, but they don't want to take the step up. They're very happy where they are. So allowing them to grow within that role, that might be to take on a new skill, become a first aider, become a fire warden, become somebody with an auditing qualification, a mental health first aider. That might be someone who we're giving an opportunity to actually run an activity like Ramadan or Pride or a Christmas meal or a celebration. So they're probably, I know you asked for 3, but they're probably the 2 ways. Yeah. It's the going into a different role, but it's also being allowed to grow within your role.
Okay. I'm just we've talked about...
Probably the 3rd one actually is making sure that we communicate in different ways the same information. So if there is a role, appreciating that some people going online, finding out about it isn't something that's going to happen. So it's making sure that we are varied in the way that we communicate the same information so that...
around opportunities.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's far more inclusive way of communicating.
we've talked about apprenticeships, we've talked about young people making career choices. Is it ever too late to get into the food manufacturing industry? What would you say to someone that's, in their 20s, 30s, 40s who is considering a career?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's never too late. And we talk about the food manufacturing industry. As I've said, there's such a variety of jobs that you don't have to have 10 years in manufacturing to then come in and make and be part of producing a box of Jaffa cakes. Because there's such a variety of jobs, and actually bringing a completely different outlook on life and a completely different set of lived experiences actually can be hugely beneficial, because usually you get the most benefit out of the most daft questions.
I think we've touched on this around how partnerships, particularly partnerships between organisations like ours, the college and McVitie's, how that can benefit the community, young people, the sector, the college. We've kind of touched on that, and I think that you've naturally talked about work-life balance and the need for that. Yeah. I'd like to have a chat with you about. You'll have to invite us to your next performance. Whether you're on stage or whether
Made
you've
in
got...
Dagenham in Morley next week. So.
Oh, brilliant! Okay, well, I haven't seen that, so we'll have to see if we can get over. I think I've got a couple of final questions. What's next for McVitie's in the next 5 to 10 years? What's next for you?
Yeah.
And are those two things aligned?
Well, I think what's next for McVitie's is we have recently closed the site in Torcross in Glasgow. So we've consolidated into 6 sites the product that we made into 7. So from a business point of view, what we need is sustained growth, but profitable growth as well. I think there's changes in the market in terms of HFSS legislation, which is about high fat, sugar, salt, and we need to be able to adapt to that. As a business, we need to make sure that our heritage brands remain relevant, but we also need to broaden our range to attract new consumers as well. So I think they're probably the big challenges. I think the other thing from a business point of view, we're a relatively young company. We're less than 10 years old in terms of Pladis. Obviously, the old United Biscuits brands and the old Ulca brands, they've been going for years and years and years, and that's absolutely great. And similar with Godiva, and Godiva have become more embedded into Pladis in the last couple of years. But we've got to find a way to make sure that they can coexist, but also share best practice and kind of understand how we can do that. How can we break Godiva, for example, into the UK is a great challenge, but also breaking McVitie's into the States, into the emerging markets as well. We're a large multinational organisation, and that gives us the benefit to try and penetrate markets that previously we hadn't been able to do that because we were national rather than global.
Yeah. So what about you? Where does Richard fit within that next 10 years?
And that, it's probably a question that's the hardest one to answer, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at it and I think, when you've been with a business for 21 years, it's obviously you have your frustrations about things not getting done quick enough and et cetera, but there's a reason why you stay somewhere for 21 years. And as a little hint, it's usually not about money, because actually people can go from job to job, to company and get those incremental pay rises. So actually, I think if money's your prime driver, I think that's a mistake. I think more and more, and I think we're seeing that with the younger generation coming into the workplace, actually business values are critically important. And again, if my values didn't align to the values that I perceive Pladis to have, McVitie's to have, but Pladis to have, probably I'd be more inclined to look for alternative employment. So I think as long as I can continue to grow in my role, and like I say, unique with food safety quality managers, that I took on the engagement, inclusion and diversity strategy and agenda for the site. a couple of years ago, and that's really allowed me to evolve in a way that, you know, previously I'd evolved in different other ways. So I think finding where those niches and where those opportunities are, and it's also for me being a good neighbour as well as a company. But yeah, I mean, the food safety quality stuff is stuff I've done 10, 12 years, and it's great, don't get me wrong, and I've got a lot of experience, but the stuff that's really exciting is also the stuff where you can make a tangible change. And yeah, so that's probably, and you know, and balancing the work-life balance. I have a very active hobby, you know. I'm not just going to be on stage next week, but I've also started rehearsing to a show to direct Oklahoma in January in Bradford. So, you know, that's sometimes 3-4 nights a week. So if I can maintain those energy levels, that's really important.
We'll have to share notes, because I directed a production of Oklahoma.
Oh, right.
Probably 14 years ago. So
well.
I'm happy to share some some inside thoughts. So
yeah,
it's been delightful to talk to you today, Richard. It really has. You know, I'm excited about the work that we can do together, the college and McVitie's, with the community, for the community, working more closely in partnership.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to see, you know, that development that you've talked about for the business and for yourself.
And I think being honest, because I think there's challenges in the business, you know, and I think sometimes we set ourselves, particularly when it comes to I&D, and ultimately understand that it's the long game as well. So, you know, we can set ourselves a target of number of women or number of non-white people in leadership roles, and that's great in terms of its intent. But if that's the sole driver, that's problematic, because you can parachute people in, you can meet that objective, you move on. What you've got to be able to understand is that structure, that substructure underneath, and that culture underneath has to evolve, grow and change to enable internal development and internal growth. So it's really important for me that we're coming to yourselves and coming to other educational institutions to hopefully make STEM jobs seem really viable, and careers in the food industry seem viable to people who perhaps didn't think they were, but particularly when it comes to to underrepresented groups. And that might not benefit McVitie's actually next year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or Pladis, but it's growing the pool of young people entering the labour market who now consider the food industry to be an industry that they may want to go into. And therefore, we're developing the next generation of employees, but we're developing our culture to make sure that it's an industry they want to come into, and that their culture is one where we're removing barriers to progress. So it doesn't matter who you are and what your gender is, what your sexuality is, what your ethnicity is. You can be the best that you can possibly be and grow within our organisation rather than have to look outside.
Brilliant. Thank you.
No.
I've got one final question, and you might have to have a little think about this. So while you're doing that, I'm just going to have a final biscuit. I'm going back to the Jaffa cake. At the end of every podcast, I ask the guests to imagine that you could send a text to your younger self. So, you know, you said you went to university in 98, so I'm guessing you didn't have a mobile phone as a teenager.
Yeah, the text should be, how have you got a mobile phone?
But, I mean, let's imagine that you did have a mobile phone as a teenager. You've got the opportunity to send one text, and it's from you now offering your younger self a piece of advice. What would it say?
Don't be afraid to take an opportunity that you don't think you're necessarily ready for. Because who are you to say that you're ready for it or not?
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
No problem.
And I look forward to meeting you again over a few more biscuits.
Yeah, pleasure.
Cheers, Richard.